Hello and welcome to my channel, I Win to Lose Gaming. Genshin Impact dropped its new endgame mode, Stygian Onslaught, and with it, well, let's talk about some tips and tricks and an overall guide as well as my honest opinion about it at the end. Stygian Onslaught is the new endgame mode, which is unlocked after reaching adventure rank 20 or so and beating some Archon quests. So it's pretty darn early, all things considered. You can access it via the event page, where you'll be stuck in a short cutscene, and then you can challenge it. Now, Stygian Onslaught is the hardest permanent endgame content to date, with, fortunately, most of the hardest parts being fairly optional, unless you're trying to buff Nilo's drip, which admittingly does instill some FOMO, which I'll address later. Fortunately, there is a secret way, it starts with a ko and ends with an op, for most players to get most of the rewards. So what is Stygian Onslaught? It's an epic battle of wits, skill, and most importantly, if you have the right characters. It consists of 3 boss battles with the option to farm artifacts as well during it. Let's actually take a look at the rewards first to best understand what to prioritize for this gameplay mode. As we can see, difficulties 1 to 3 have 150 Primo Gems each, and difficulties 4 and 5 have 1 Dust of Enlightenment each, with each of them also giving some Mora and experience. Finally, difficulty 6, which is the hidden difficulty only unlocked after beating difficulty 5, provides a temporary weapon skin. So for most players, the priority should be to clear difficulties 1 to 3 for the Primo Gems, and for more endgame players, clearing difficulties 4 and 5 is great for the Dust of Enlightenments as well. So what are Dust of Enlightenments? These are used to reroll artifacts, which I might talk about a bit more later in the video, or I might not, I guess we'll see. There's also a guaranteed Dust of Enlightenment for spending 1,200 resin on artifacts in this gameplay mode. Now, yes, this gameplay mode is very difficult, but fortunately you can utilize matchmaking with random people for difficulties 1 through 3. However, for difficulty 4 and above, you all need to be in the same world, so utilizing Discord channels and such will help you find a party for difficulties 4 and above. Fortunately, you can get all of the rewards for difficulties 4 and below via co-op, but while you can co-op for difficulties 5 and 6, unfortunately you won't get the rewards for clearing those in co-op, so that's just purely for fun. Now let's get this part out of the way. You've heard me mention farming artifacts. Well, while there is a disturbance outbreak, this is actually the best way and the most recommended way to farm artifacts, at least while it's available for the first 10-ish days or so. First, you can set which artifact set to farm, and then after beating up a boss, I believe in difficulty 3 or above, you have the option to spend resin on, well, gaining those artifacts. As far as I can tell, the rewards appear to match your world level, and as an added bonus, every 120 resin you spend, you get 1 bonus 5-star artifact. For context, this is roughly 15% more 5-star artifacts, which is why, moving forward, it's highly recommended to just focus on farming artifacts while this disturbance outbreak is available, and of course farming other stuff while it's not. And just to be clear, you can only redeem the Dust of Enlightenment from spending 1,200 resin once, but you can infinitely claim the extra bonus 5-star artifacts, which is nice. Alright, now that we know the rewards, let's actually start beating up the bosses because they're not going to beat themselves up for us. There are 3 different boss fights, and you need to clear all of them on each corresponding difficulty to get that corresponding difficulty's rewards. And also, clearing difficulty 3 will get you all the rewards from difficulties 1 through 3, so if you can beat that, just skip to difficulty 3. Now the goal of each fight is simple. Beat the boss in 120 seconds, or if you fail, start inching those fingers closer to that wallet, which, stop it, it probably isn't worth it. Also, each boss has their own independent 120-second timers. Stygian Onslaught also differs from the Abyss in that you don't actually start with full energy. So your first rotation for many teams is all about battering up your team. Favonius and Sacrificial Stonks are up again, yet again, with this gameplay mode. This of course also favors characters who don't rely on starting the fight with full bursts, like Mavuika and Skirk are just a couple of examples. As for team building, for difficulties 1 through 3, you can reuse characters and stuff to your heart's desire, making this much easier to get 450 Primo Gems. However, for difficulties 4 and beyond, this is where things start to get difficult, as you will need to build 3 different teams and lock in each character, their weapon, and artifacts to a specific fight. So yeah, you'll want 12 well-built characters, and they also can't share gear. And not just any 12 characters, but 12 characters that can handle the mechanics of each fight. Stygian Onslaught also provides Exalted One's buffs to a batch of characters, where these characters will all have 20% more attack, HP, and defense, and they also provide a good idea of who Hoyoverse is basically recommending you to use for this gameplay mode. Also, starting from difficulty 5, the bosses will have additional mechanics which will make them frankly completely busted if you try to ignore the mechanics. As for the difficulties themselves, to put it into perspective, overall I'd say difficulty 4 is a bit harder than Abyss 12, with, as an example, the current Abyss 12-3 Secret Scam Automaton having 4,492,262 health with a recommended clear time of 90 seconds. This means that in Abyss, your team needs to output an average of 49,914 damage against this thing. Meanwhile, Stygian Onslaught difficulty 4, this boss has 6,577,874 hit points, and with 120 seconds, this means you'll want to do around 54,815 average DPS, which is about 10% more than Abyss 12. Not only that, but for Abyss, you can start the chamber with full energy if you want to. And the Abyss card buffs tend to outweigh the potential buffs that Stygian Onslaught provides. So yeah, this is in my opinion more difficult overall than Abyss 12. As for difficulty 5, the HP value isn't as massive of an increase as actually I expected, but the mechanics do get more punishing. As for difficulty 6, well, for most of us, just forget about it. Alright, so finally, without further ado, let's dive into each individual boss fight. We will be focused on difficulty 5, aka Fearless difficulty, because most of the stuff there will apply to lower difficulties, although I will specify what is difficulty 5 exclusive. Starting with the Hydro Tulpa, this thing is permanently infused with Hydro, and needless to say, is completely immune to Hydro damage. Fortunately, Pyro damage that applies Pyro will vape against it, making Pyro DPS characters pretty good against it. Occasionally, it will also summon a couple of these little clone buddies, which you should definitely prioritize taking out because the Hydro Tulpa will try to absorb them. If it successfully absorbs them, on difficulty 5 it will even heal itself, so it is imperative to destroy these little clones. On difficulty 5, these little buddies actually have 12 units of Hydro Shield, or alternatively, they have about 12% of the Hydro Tulpa's HP, which just forget about it. Fortunately, you can break them instantly by freezing them. Alternatively, Dendro also does a great job at depleting 12 units of Hydro Shield pretty efficiently, especially a character like Nahida who can Xerox them out of existence. On difficulty 5, it will summon this shield thing, which appears to be based on its max HP, and it has a durability of roughly 8 to 10% of its max HP. If you fail to break the shield though, it will one-shot whatever character is on field, so yeah. Fortunately, when it gains this shield, it will reset all cooldowns and fully fill up your team's energy. As such, dumping your ultimates and skills right before its shield pops up is the best approach, as you can, well, dump it all again right when its shield appears. So those are the Hydro Tulpa's mechanics. Let's talk about some team compositions. Needless to say, Pyro main DPS characters like Mavuika and Arlecchino, and to a lesser extent Yoimiya and Hu Tao because, well, they just do less damage, are great for this fight because they'll vape a lot of their damage. Citlali is also surprisingly nearly perfect for this fight, because Citlali's continuous AoE cryo application will kill all the little summons next to you. Not only that, but Citlali, by triggering freeze against the Hydro Tulpa, will actually lower its resistances to Pyro. Now, it is important to note that whether you're using Citlali, Shilinin, or Yansan, none of them can provide the Cinder City buff, since they need to interact with the Pyro element to grant the Cinder City buff, and well, the Hydro Tulpa is always Hydro. However, Pyro Traveler can actually trigger the Cinder City, which makes her uniquely pretty good for this fight. Now, looking at some of the teams that people use to clear this, needless to say, Mavuika, Shilinin, and Citlali were the most popular. However, it does appear that you can brute force this with an overloaded team as well, as this guy Sacha did, or I guess Braxophone did with his Constellation 6 Chiori, the Mad Lad. Just keep in mind that the boss's mechanics will give you a lot more challenge with these types of teams, so typically a Dendro or Cryo character is recommended, especially Cryo for instantly breaking the little buddies. Alternatively, Hyper Bloom does decently well, as you will get plenty of blooms against this boss since it always has Hydro on it, so every Dendro attack that applies Dendro will generate a bloom. Now, one quick tip for Mavuika is to use her charge attack dash N1 combo. This will allow her to vape all of her charged attacks and resets the 3-hit ICD much quicker than any alternative combo. So yeah, that about summarizes it for the Hydro Tulpa. Okay, I figured I'd give you guys a quick yap session and example clear of a more accessible team for difficulty 5, and in this case, I'm using my Constellation 0 Refinement 1 Arlecchino. I do still have a few Constellation 0 Refinement 1 characters on my account, and fortunately Arlecchino is one of them. So we're going to give her a spin with a pretty free-to-play friendly team. Well, okay, maybe not that free-to-play friendly, but I guess 4-star friendly teammates. We've got Bennett with the Sapwood Blade, we've got Diona with the Sacrificial Bow and Instructors, and finally we have Charlotte with Thrilling Tales, I believe, and the Tenacity of the Millelith to give, some buffs that she can to the team. Now, there's a reason why I brought Charlotte, and it's a pretty interesting choice, you might think, and this is because Charlotte is actually pretty good at taking out the little clones. You can see there, just line them up like that, and then, take a picture of them, and bam, just like that, you've photocopied them out of existence. But Charlotte, of course, is nowhere near as good as Nahida for the kind of Xerox strategy, because Nahida will, leave the lock on to the targets there. But Charlotte, though, of course, being able to freeze him will just one-shot him, which is great. And Diona, she can also sometimes, if you're lucky, for these side things to target the enemy. But yeah, here we can see that hopefully we are able to take out his shield with Arlecchino's pokey pokes, and they do pretty good damage against it. We can see that after we took out his shield, it actually took some damage. And I also brought Charlotte because her Thrilling Tales buff provides something meaningful to Arlecchino's damage, and I also brought Diona because Diona's Elemental Burst also provides some meaningful damage buffs for Arlecchino, which means that, they're not completely dead weight besides literally just breaking the Hydro Tulpa's little buddy guys, which, I mean, that's their main purpose, like, let's be real. But we can see here that we are also lining that up to break the little guys, but I think Charlotte's Burst actually got them. So you can see the key is to kind of manage how you break the little guys in between rotations, and, then just spend your time on field with the main DPS character, in this case Arlecchino, to do some decent damage. Now this was, I'd say about 4 or 5 attempts, and I cleared it with just a few seconds left, but I feel like this is super unoptimized, so there's definitely a lot of wiggle room for clear speed with this Arlecchino team. Let's move on to the Lava Dragon statue, where the first phase of this thing is practically invulnerable to damage with 200% resistances. You need to fill up its circle by hitting it with pyro attacks. Basically, the more pyro numbers, the faster the gauge fills up. Once you fill up its gauge once, it will enter its second phase, where it now has 45% resistances except for Pyro, where it has 200% resistance against Pyro. And just like the first phase, hitting it with a bunch of Pyro numbers will fill up its bar for it to go into its third phase. Now, while it's in its second phase, you are able to do meaningful damage with certain teams if you are able to shred specific elements. Like, for example, you can shred Dendro with the Deepwood Memories, and you can shred Electro with Overloaded, or Shilanin. So certain teams can do decent damage even against this second phase boss. It's very important to note though that Hydro and Cryo damage against this thing during its second phase will deplete the little bar in the top right. So you typically want to avoid Hydro and Cryo damage against the second phase, barring some very specific strategies. that aren't for most of us, because your top priority during the second phase, generally speaking, is to fill up this second bar via a bunch of pyro numbers, which will cause it to move on to its third phase. Now, in its third phase, it will now be crippled for about 17 seconds, and all of its resistances will be lowered to 10%. It also no longer has permanent pyro on it, so you can literally do anything to this thing during its third phase. After it recovers, it will return back to its first phase, where you have to repeat the process all over again. One more note about this boss is that it does lose some of its HP when you push it through its phases, further encouraging you to apply as much pyro as possible that you can to it. So now that we know how this boss works, let's take a look at how to accomplish the goal of murdering it. Needless to say, Kanish burning or just general burning teams like Emily is fantastic against this thing. Each individual burning tick counts as an instance of pyro damage and thus will fill up its bar very efficiently. Alternatively, overloaded Chevreuse teams are pretty solid as well, as characters like Xiangling Bennett and Klee can all break its pyro shield very efficiently. Not only that, but the 40% resistance shred to electro damage means that some overloaded focused electro damage characters, like for example Varesa, Clorinde, or potentially even Raiden, can do meaningful non-negligible damage to its second phase. Now, another approach is because you can literally do anything to it while it's in its third phase, you can actually use Hydro and Cryo DPS characters after you knock it down, but make sure to use them mainly during its third phase. Okay, up next we have a Constellation 0 Refinement 1 Clorinde clear, and Clorinde is also one of the few 5-star characters I do have at Constellation 0. And this one I would say overall is the easiest out of the bunch, especially if you have a decent Chevreuse overloaded team. And I will say that my Eon-san as well as Chevreuse are both at Constellation 6, which is definitely worth mentioning and keeping that in mind. So yeah, now the thing about this team is that actually I think Clorinde is almost certainly replaceable with even someone like Fischl in this case. But, what was nice about this attempt was that it took even less attempts than the Arlecchino run, and I would say it is equally unoptimized. Well, less attempts generally means less optimization, but we can see here that I am going for a bit of damage during its second phase, because I found that trying to, chip down the boss during these phases is pretty helpful against it, because otherwise, you might struggle to clear it. And as mentioned earlier, because Overloaded can shred the resistance against its second phase, while, some of the teammates and stuff are still building the gauge, this means that you can actually get, a decent amount of damage during its second phase, even with its 45% resistances. We are able to actually, deal a lot of damage to it in just a couple of rotations. We even got mostly a full rotation against its third phase, but now we are back to it's a geo-human form or whatever, but this rock form is basically invincible, so you really have to dump a lot of pyro numbers onto it. We can see here that some decently invested Constellation 0 Refinement 1 teams are definitely able to handle, the bosses like the Hydra Tulpa as well as the Lava Dragon statue. And we can see here that we got a pretty reasonable clear with very few attempts, which is good to see. And yeah, I'm pretty sure 4-star variations of this team are likely going to be able to clear this one. This one is likely one of the easier ones to actually successfully clear with 4-star characters, which is good to see. But, of course, not everyone is going to be able to do that. It just really depends on your account. And hopefully you have some constellations on Eon-san or Chevreuse or something like that to help you out. As for the third boss, well, it's another boss locked behind a specific mechanic, with this one being cryo related. It starts off practically invincible with 270% resistances across the board. Basically, you have to hit it with very high frequency of cryo attacks, at least once every 0.6 seconds or so to deplete its circle. Once the circle is fully depleted, it actually does provide you a lot of energy particles, as well as its resistances being lowered to 30%, except for cryo, which is further reduced to negative 30%. So yeah, as you can see, Hoyoverse is trying to make you use cryo DPS characters against this thing. This boss can also punish Natlan characters, as if you stay in Night Soul state for too long, it will freak out and go full racist against Nat Laney's characters, with extra powerful attacks and elevated resistances at around 110%. So needless to say, Skirk and Escoffier are literally perfect for this boss, and the other two slots are typically a bit more flexible. However, if you are using Skirk, you'll want an off-field hydro applicator like for example Furina or Yelan or something to generate Void Rifts. However, what if you don't have Skirk, Escoffier, etc.? Well, regardless, I highly recommend two cryo characters regardless of the team. Wriothesley, Ayaka, and Ganyu all do a decent job against this thing. As for 4-star characters, Layla does apply a ton of cryo as long as her shield is active, so you do want to dodge a bit, and Kaya and Rosaria also apply a decent amount of cryo. However, regardless of who you use, at least 2 cryo characters is recommended, and you also need some way to actually do damage. Characters like Wriothesley, Ayaka, and Ganyu can all deal some decent damage, but of course they definitely pale in comparison to how much damage Skirk does. But I'm sure players can clear this boss with those characters, especially with something like Escoffier. So yeah, this boss, the Secret Scam Automaton, is definitely one of the most restrictive fights that we've ever had in Genshin Impact, and clearly strongly favors certain cryo characters over others. Okay, now we are at the clear for the Secret Scam Automaton, and unfortunately I did not have the team on my account that's appropriate for actually taking out difficulty 5. So instead I'm doing a Wriothesley solo run with my Wriothesley at Constellation 6. So do keep that in mind that this is not going to be representative of pretty much anyone's clear except for those few of you who do have Wriothesley at Constellation 6. And I know Wriothesley owners love solo runs, so here we go. We've got Wriothesley against this thing, and we can see that him alone is actually able to keep the Secret Scam Automaton in its low power mode or whatever with enough cryo to basically keep it standing still, and the boss basically doesn't do anything as long as you are constantly hitting with it with cryo numbers, which is pretty funny. Literally, it's just like this the whole fight. So yeah, unfortunately when it comes to this boss, looking through various clears and stuff, the clear like kind of team variation was so sparse and limited, and is literally just everyone using Escoffier and pretty much Skirk, you know, maybe a couple Wriothesleys here and there, and I personally didn't even see Ayakas or Ganyus, but I didn't look that hard for too many teams. But the roughly dozen or so that I did see were all Skirk, Escoffier, and a couple Wriothesleys like I said. So yeah, not really great team flexibility. This one is pretty much for difficulty 5. If you've got these characters, you've got them. If not, well, you know, let's hope the community cooks up some stuff that I wasn't able to come up with, because my 4-star only characters as well as the few limited 5-star characters of Constellation 0, Refinement 5 weren't able to handle this. So yeah, that about covers it for the boss mechanics. Let's talk about some more general gameplay tips. Energy, which I have always described as a moving target, has become an even bigger moving target in this gameplay mode. Since everyone starts at 0 energy, this changes everything. As such, the best and frankly only way to deal with this is to experiment and mix and match your artifacts as needed to fulfill their energy requirements. Go in there, try out a rotation, and see if your characters have full energy or not. And also remember the Favonius as well as Sacrificial Sword, as those will help you tremendously with various energy requirements. Not only that, but the boss like the Secret Scam Automaton will actually just give you a bunch of energy if you deplete it. So yeah, as mentioned earlier, energy, you're gonna have to experiment. But generally speaking, the more energy recharge you have on characters that need it, the better. Next, I wanted to talk a bit about expectations. Generally speaking, if you're able to clear Abyss 12 reliably, assuming you have the proper characters, difficulty 4 is a bit harder than Abyss 12. But let's be completely honest, this series of bosses is a roster check. So don't feel bad if you can't complete the Secret Scam Automaton if you don't have Escoffier or Skirk, because the boss was just designed to be like that. And most importantly, don't feel pressure to pull. In my opinion, pulling just for this isn't worth it, unless, you know, you're into that, because the bosses will rotate and we're gonna have different bosses for different Stygian Onslaughts. There are frankly so many characters that are practically unplayable here. Like Hydro DPS characters like Neuvillette actually struggle to find a team slot. We don't even need to mention a lot of the older characters in the game. and certain characters just perform way too well compared to others against certain bosses like Skirk versus the secret scam Automaton or Kanish versus the lava dragon statue. I've got to be completely honest, I think the introduction of Stygian Onslaught should have been more generalized bosses, like for example replacing the secret scam Automaton with the Primo Geo Vishap, which would resist a Petch element, as well as Geo and physical damage, but otherwise makes a great damage sponge, and its main mechanic just requiring a shield, thus making team building much less restrictive. It's no secret that all the banner characters for version 5.7, Skirk and Shenhe for the secret scam Automaton, and Mavuika and Emily are all fantastic for this game mode, but for the wrong reasons in my opinion. Generally speaking, having one boss out of the 3 with these types of team building restrictions is fine in my opinion, but in this case having 2, arguably even 3, is a bit too much in my opinion. Still, with that being said, there are a lot of positives to this gameplay mode. I think the distribution of rewards is fairly reasonable, with difficulties 1 through 4 which you can even co-op for, as well as one of the feathers being accessible just by spending resin, gives something significant to everyone at all levels of investment into the game, which is nice. And an extra feather at difficulty 5, while a bit rough for many players, provides a reasonable reward for well-invested accounts that will also pull the right characters. As for the weapon cosmetics, personally as a whale, I'm glad it's time gated and expires when the next Stygian Onslaught comes around. With it expiring, I believe it gives less incentive for players to waste their money to chase down this weapon cosmetic. And not only that, but only the tippity toppest of even the whales can get the 5-star weapon skin, which requires you to clear all 3 bosses on dire difficulty or difficulty 6 within 180 seconds. Overall, I was hoping it'd be something even more trivial than this pretty cool looking weapon skin, for example such as a name card or something. But I guess this is an okay compromise being a temporary cosmetic item. Personally, I think they should move the 4-star cosmetic version to difficulty 5 and just clearing difficulty 5, and they can keep the 5-star version in the last dire difficulty. So yeah, Stygian Onslaught balances the reward system for dedicated players and lower spenders in mind, while also giving some real optional endgame content for whales. Hopefully this guide helped you a bit to understand this gameplay mode. Let me know if I missed anything and let me know what you managed to clear this with and at what difficulty. As always, I appreciate every single one of you. This is I Went to Lose, signing out.